At this time, we'd like to ask all the speakers on our panel to come to the table to begin our panel discussion. Just wanted to encourage anyone, the virtual participants, if you have any questions, to please submit them in the chat box and to also include your name and affiliation. And anyone with questions in our audience to please come to the microphone, and just a friendly reminder to begin with your name and affiliation.
Thank you. Manuel Saltoteyes from ICR and Royal Marsden in London. So this is a question on clinical implementation of integrated diagnostics, something that Shorab has referred briefly in his talk, but I think it's very important. It is reproducibility. So let's suppose for a moment that an algorithm has been created in institution A with the clinical and the metadata and the images of institution A. We take the algorithm to institution B and it doesn't work. Or it doesn't work to the level and the extent of clinical relevance that it has in institution A. Is that a reflection of the quality of the algorithm? Is that a reflection of the quality of the clinical information and the images that are generated by institution B? Has it nothing to do with quality, but perhaps with the way the information is generated, and therefore the algorithm has to be adapted to that new institution? Should algorithms therefore be institution dependent, and therefore how are we going to take them through FDA? Or am I just jet lagged and I'm created a problem where there isn't one? I'd love the opinion from Shorab, and perhaps whoever else can answer. Thank you.
That's a tough one for this late in the afternoon. But, this is vitally important. I think every study that's published, including ours, is overfit to the data. These models are complex, they have lots of parameters, and they have very few inputs. That's a recipe for overfitting. And so I think, how do we overcome that? So I'll just give you our example in the PDL1 study. Of course, when we submitted it, I anticipated that the first comment that was going to come back from the reviewers was, can you validate this in an external cohort? And sure enough, that was the first comment that came back. But there was no external cohort because, as I mentioned, it took more than a year to pull the data together, which was heroically done by a specialist physician who was just interested in doing the study. And I think to find an external cohort would have been really a major challenge, actually. And we reached out to a few people, but it just wasn't possible. And MSK, thanks to Charles and other people, we have released our genome sequencing data, but that's not the case at other institutions. So even at some institutions, even if you're a faculty member at the institution, sometimes you can't access the clinical sequencing data. Right. So it's not just a free resource. So I have two solutions for this. One is we have to embrace the concept of open data. So our data from that paper is all released to the public. You can follow the links in the paper right now and download the data and train your models on that data. Okay, so that's principle number one. That's both when you publish, but also interinstitutionally. If you embrace an open data policy, I guarantee you it will float all the boats higher. Our MSK Impact data has led to no less than 700 peer-reviewed papers. And I think people were worried at the beginning that everyone was going to self-scoop each other and that it wouldn't work out. But the reality is that everyone's benefited from open data. And now we have 75,000 tumors that have been sequenced that everyone at MSK can access. If you have a finding, you can try to validate it in another tumor type or another cohort, et cetera. And it's extremely powerful. So this field will not move forward until we embrace open data. I can guarantee that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I thought that was a great question. And in many ways, the answer to your series of questions is yes, but there are ways to know. So is it the data? There are ways to know. Some of these large federated data sets like Odyssey, the data in the OMOP model has 810 million patients in it. So looking at site-specific variation is very possible and part of the trial. And in fact, they write the inclusion criteria. Would your data be fit for this algorithm or for this study with those sort of criteria in mind? And I think that's really important. So it could be the data, but you can find out. And in many ways, sort of, if the algorithm didn't work at the other site, that's the opportunity for more learning, right? It doesn't work, universally, and that's okay. We should expect that. We should not be dismayed by that. Because there is so much variation in so many aspects of these things. And we think, oh, we don't have statistical assumptions sometimes with our, large machine learning approach. They're assumption-free. But in fact, there are always some kind of assumptions that go into this. And so we need to really pull those out and think about why would this not be working well in this particular setting. And I think that's the real work. And in fact, before it's large-scale implementation, that's on all of us to sort of do those studies. It's also true that when people see the results, even if it's giving them the right answer, that they do the wrong thing, that's the algorithm's fault as well. It's not, we have to understand that people don't understand things that are being sent to them. So all of this is part of it, and I would just say, don't give up at that. That's part of the work, and should be expected.
Just want to make a comment here to follow on the comments that were made by Sorab in response to Manuel's question. I think another important ingredient in this process is making the algorithm available so others can test the algorithm in their hands. Yep. And that has to be one of the disseminated requirements of the ensuring that reproducibility is achieved, both within the discovery data set and in data sets that are external to that. So I think that's an important point, and that's, I guess, a point of principle that we try to employ in how we're going about business. The second thing I wanted to say is that there is something to be said for the falsifiability of science, right? Most of what we're trying to do, or supposedly if we're trying to do this right, is we're not trying to prove something. We're supposed to be trying to disprove it, right? And if you've relentlessly tried to disprove what is a particular hypothesis, then you're left with a certain degree to which you'll say, here's the p-value of this observation, and it can't be explained by random chance. So I think that is an important principle to keep in mind. The way you get to the truth is to try and disprove as many alternative hypotheses as possible. And the final thing I was going to say is that I'm sure there are several laboratories here that report chemistry results for potassium, but the reference values from hospital A or laboratory B or C are never exactly the same. So each institution has to calibrate whatever assay or assay system within the practice standards of that laboratory. And that's understood within their system to determine whether something is within the reference range or outside the reference range. And I don't think those rules are going to change whether or not we're doing this using more sophisticated approaches or more complex approaches as have been described.
Anyone on the panel want to follow up on that?
Yeah, just one last point on this, and I think this is remains to be seen just how effective this is. But the concept of federated learning, I think, actually might have a major role to play here, in the sense that federated learning is essentially that you can bring the algorithm to data, you basically embed the results of the data in a way that the data doesn't have to leave the institution or the network where the data sits. You get a representation of a model, and you can do this, repeat this at multiple sites, and then integrate those embeddings from the different sites. And I think that's a very powerful concept in machine learning that actually may apply very nicely into the validation and reproducibility question. And so it's something that should be explored. There was a paper recently by, I think, a company called Alkin on this in breast cancer in Nature Medicine that could provide a model for that.
Go ahead.
So, Regina Barzilai, MIT. I actually want to go back to the first question and to discuss, the assumption that the model trained in one institution are most likely not going to scale to another institution. And I just want you to think about your own iPhone when you can recognize your face independently, whether we are in this room, in the snow. It's really hard to find a place where your face will not be recognized. Unfortunately, the majority of clinical algorithms that we've developed do not have the robustness, and not only because there is something very special about mammogram versus your face, just because most of this algorithm took existing software and just applied it on medical data, and they didn't put the same degree of mathematical sophistication and engineering that is put, when it recognizes your face on iPhone independently of the location. Of course, there are some cases where it doesn't. So the good news is that in machine learning in general, there was significant move in the last 3 or 4 years to really work on the robustness of the algorithm, and there was a lot of progress that had been made. And when I'm looking at Nature Medicine and the other venues that publish clinical AI work, I rarely see this sophistication getting into the clinical AI algorithms where there are special models developed for that. They are not used. So this is point number one. So we shouldn't be complacent and say we just expect to have an algorithm that only works for MGH. The second point is about, publishing standards. And because we're talking about policy forum here, I want to go back to the publishing standards. Of course, there are unique situations when you produce a very unique data that nobody has and you want to share this advancement. However, if you're looking at the majority of papers that are published in this field, they are not doing something unique. They're working on mammograms, they're working on x-rays, they're working on pathology slides, and many times we can find them. And again, the good things that we're even looking at the current Nature Medicine changes and others, that now in order to publish a paper, you have to demonstrate that it works across institutions. And I would just reference my own paper in Journal of Clinical Oncology. We had to demonstrate that the model works in 8 different institutions across the world. So there is no reason not to expect that. And the bad science, and we've seen many examples of it when we first published a paper where we only did it on one data set, and we never released the code. And unfortunately, Google had this very bad tendency of doing those papers that none of us could replicate, even when the public data sets were used. This is the type of science that shouldn't be happening, and I think it's our opportunity of those who review and decide about the policy just say no to this science. There is absolutely no reason to continue with this bad behavior. Thank you.
Amen.
Go ahead.
Hi, excuse me, Gwen Darien, National Patient Advocate Foundation and a member of the National Cancer Policy Forum. So I just wanted to thank Mary for her presentation and really bringing in this human element, because it's not just about the diagnostics, it's also about what happens to them with the patients. And so as a patient advocate, as a 3-time cancer survivor, risk communication is really key in all of this. And it has changed a lot, and a lot of the risk communication did not engender trust, because if you talk about relative risk for patients, it means nothing. But if you talk about absolute risk and you make it and you talk about it in a way that is in a way that people can use and that's really valuable to them as they're making decisions, it is a huge service to the patients that everybody serves. And also the lack of the unwillingness to talk about what some of the risks and some of the harms might be actually cause more harm. And I'll tell you my story from my background, which is a story that's I'm in a cohort of young adult cancer survivors who are now getting second and third cancers. But when I was boosting my white blood cells after chemotherapy, the doctor didn't tell me about what some of the potential side effects of that were going to be, and I ended up with horrible bone pain, had no idea what was going on, almost ended up in the emergency. And I asked my oncologist about it. He said, well, I didn't want you to all of a sudden have that. I didn't want you to worry about it. We're always worried that if we tell you about the side effect, you're going to get that side effect. So I think that I'm really grateful for this session that brings it all together, where it talks about how this healthcare is delivered and what is really important to people. So thank you. And I don't know if you yeah, wasn't really a question. It was sort of a question.
Thank you for sharing your story. It's really hard to talk about those things, but people often wonder, was that just one surgeon who told you that? But it's not. It's not. We all talk about this should be standard of care, but it's not standard of practice. It's hard to talk about the things that might happen, whether it's because we think you're worrying a patient or because you don't really want to admit that there's limitations to what we can do and that they're not a magic pill with no side effects or magic treatment that's going to do everything we want it to do and none of the potential downsides. And that's why I think these tools will really help to level that playing field, to make sure we're being transparent even when it's uncomfortable to talk about, and to start the conversation. It shouldn't be the end of the conversation, but just to list things in a way people can understand and digest. So thank you.
And if you only talk about relative risk, people can make decisions that are based on really bad advice, evidence. It's the way that people speak to patients is often so I would say condescending and assuming that patients can't understand things. Patients can understand so much more than anybody else than what they're given credit for, because we all want to have the information to make the decisions that are best for us.
Yeah, if you're motivated to learn it, you can learn it.
You
we
can
just
learn
need to give people the
anything
data.
if you're motivated, as long as people don't use jargon. Thank you.
So I want to ask a follow-up question, Dr. Politi. So you did a really nice job in the presentation of describing some of the evidence from decision aids about how to display data to try to reduce confusion around risk. What about the issues around integration of these algorithms into a clinical encounter, both the interface that the clinician and the patient are having and the conversations? Do you have some advice from the literature on how best to bring in the algorithms?
So the only tool, I showed one example of that with the breast reconstruction tool that pulled in some of this validated risk prediction. And I have to say it's mixed, because most of the literature suggests that people don't want to enter this data on their own because it may be missing, or we may not even have that answer, or patients don't know what their values might be, and clinicians may not have the time for it. So we thought automating it from the EHR would help. But there's always missing fields, and there's always these limitations of where the data are coming from. They have to be in standardized data elements, not necessarily in the free text, although you can search there. It was a big lift for both our institution and the other institutions involved. So I would, and then, the follow-up, they said, well, could we go back to having people enter it on their own again? Because that would just be simpler than all of this build from the informatics perspective. So I would say we're getting there, but we don't have all of the uniform electronic health systems as opposed to electronic health records. We don't have the standardized processes for how the data are entered and stored, and then multiple institutions have their own. I say they don't talk to each other as easily. So if you want it to be scalable outside of one center, it's more difficult. So I'd be open to hearing other people's thoughts about that.
Anyone want to follow up on that?
I mean, this is an area that we've tried to study at length, and it is really challenging to pick one place. It's sort of, it's a very general question, and a lot of implementation science goes into trying to, asking the people who will be receiving this how different examples look, or really working with them to understand what is the possibility here, especially in trying to understand where there's value, where there's some benefit, and that whatever the cost is of doing that is mitigated. And so it makes it hard to just simply say that. However, I do think these principles are really good, especially in my research. I almost always try and think of the person who doesn't have the medical knowledge that we might have. How can I best communicate this so they could understand that? And that's a really useful tool for everything, because even care team members, clinicians can benefit from that, because it helps them to communicate it, and actually sometimes helps them to understand it better. I think we assume that our numeracy and our health literacy amongst our care team are really incredible, but sometimes people have blind spots as well. So that's a really useful precept that I try to apply.
So we were just starting to talk about user interfaces and EHR, electronic health systems in the future, and data visualization. So we were wondering what kind of recommendations based on lessons learned you all would recommend to overcome the challenges, or to begin to overcome the challenges of implementing the multi-specialty process for using precision diagnostics, and particularly in regards to workflow, as well as teamwork aspects such as coordination, communication, and shared decision making, as well as, like we were saying, building the user interface to bring in all these different data streams.
So I can take a stab at that. So I think one of the biggest challenges in the current design is that we tend to organize data by data type. So like all the labs are in one space, all the images are in one space, on and on and on it goes. Where when we think about what we actually need to facilitate communication and decision making, it's not so much data types, it's what data do I need in this moment for the decision that I'm making. So, where you can bring in a lab and an image and some notes and on and on and on and on, so that it's all just right there. And if it can be contextually aware, so that the data that you're looking at is related to what you're trying to do in any moment. So that's one way that we're thinking about these data visualization platforms, in that it's very sensitive to not just the types of data that you need, but what are you doing in that moment. And so when you're able to do that as well, kind of going back to the communication between clinicians, because I think that is a huge pain point. Someone earlier said, heaven forbid you have to page somebody. I forget. So, and I was like, yeah, but that still absolutely happens. And so when you are able to, at a glance, understand the story of the patient, the narrative associated with, here's why the patient is here, and here's what's going, here's the H&P, and, that little report handoff that we have to do every single time. And we know that there's a tremendous amount of risk involved with every single one of those handoff reports. If the data visualization allows you to see all of that history at one moment and be able to correlate all of those elements in one moment, it makes the communication a lot easier, and it level sets. Right? So that I'm not the one trying to figure out the narrative over and over and over again, shift over shift over shift. It's just right there.
Sorab, did you have anything to add to this as far as recommendations as well? And David and others after that?
Doran's presentation this morning was quite, his image there with all of the diagnostics around. The concept of the digital patient is something that we're exploring at MSK, so that the interface becomes patient-centric and the information is pulled on the basis of a patient. And that's the granularity of the decision is based on the unit. That's the unit, right? And so I completely agree with CJ in that, sequestering the data by type is inefficient in that regard because everything needs to be centered around the patient. And so the concept of the digital patient, I think, is a good one. Hard to implement, but I think because I think the insights that we draw from multimodal integration also need to be somehow captured. And it's not just that you have a picture of the histology image, but it's like, what are the properties of that histology image that lead you to a set of characteristics that from which you'd want to make a decision. And the same thing goes for genomics and radiology and labs and et cetera. So that's the challenge is then, we might have all the data that's surrounding a patient, but then pulling that together in order to make a decision, I think is something that is not necessarily UI based, but I believe that ultimately that should be in the UI. So what gets weighted in which context and how is that weighting done? That we're nowhere close to that, I think, but that's what's needed.
Go ahead, David.
Yeah. So I think of this as like a grand challenge, which is fun for me. So this idea of what data should be prioritized at what time, how do we summarize data so it's understandable but still doesn't take so long and so much of your attention to sort of work with? How do we allow, I actually saw it here, you all might call it annotation. How do we allow people to say this piece here in this image or this piece here is not only speaks to me but is related to something else? So I saw that today. So that kind of annotation or adjudication of what's sort of most important. And then the final things I think about is sort of understandability and actionability. And the last two I think are really important because they do require study. So sometimes in informatics, we think about the way that we interact with healthcare data related to a person, especially with somebody with complex condition. Are we just foraging? Like if you've done this in clinic, you like pull every piece of data out of every other tab, you're just sort of gathering it around versus moving to a more agricultural planned effort that some, for instance, virtual tumor boards start to move to. And we don't study that enough. There's a way to study a lot of that. Industrial engineering is one way to understand how to put it into different workflows and understand, but also we don't even look at what people look at as much as we should. And I think that's really important because actually there's real harm that's done when data are missed, especially in really patients with lots and lots of data. And we really have to spend more time, adapting our algorithms in some way to say, not only did I think all these features were important for my model, but also I see that people looked at these other data elements, and then I can sort of try and figure out why that is and how we use that. So I think there's a lot of great work to be done there.
So one problem that recently happened in West Virginia was a patient visited the hospital, WVU Healthcare, and after receiving the diagnosis, the patient went back home and committed suicide the same day. So if there is a way where AI can be utilized at the moment when a clinician is delivering the diagnosis for the first time to identify whether this patient or this patient type is more likely to get into severe depression or more likely to have a suicide ideation, if that can be prevented, that can help contribute to the ongoing work and also contribute to the way any kind of risk information can or should be communicated.
Did you want to say something?
This was thinking about the communication, after we get the workflow down and we're trying to actually work with the patient in the room. I think that the graphics on some of our designs tend to be really complicated and people love this animation and all this other fancy stuff. But when there's a patient in the room, that can be really distracting. And sometimes the simple diagrams that you can even circle with, a little iPad pencil or something that you can add to based on the personalization, they speak better than some of the really complicated and fancy designs on some of our decision aids. And I think it's just because that's what people are able to see and digest, and sometimes it looks great, but you don't realize what somebody else is going to see when they see the same image. Images and graphics, I think, are the hardest to create in all of these tools for patients because everybody responds differently. So the simple ones are usually the clearest, and then you can add to it with your own personalization.
That kind of goes to a point made earlier about making it easy, and easy to interpret and understand as well. Go ahead, last question.
Nick Trentadue from Epic, and this question is more for Avishek, but curious if others have thoughts. I liked how you said, do you only trust AI when it confirms your beliefs? And I was curious how that, I guess, bias stops or prevents putting more AI and more information and operationalizing it into clinicians' hands, and how you might think that inherent bias of trusting the AI is confirmatory versus not confirmatory inhibits adoption.
Yes, so assuming that the point of integrating AI into oncology is to fill that gap where humans cannot do it, right? So in the moment, if we go through this logic that only when it confirms a doctor's recommendation, doctor follows it, then that point of filling up that gap is not being fulfilled. So our intervention should be designed such that even the moment when doctors think that person is healthy but AI is saying is not, there should be a protocol or a guideline for that particular clinician to go back and reconsider the diagnosis, and then either retrain the model accordingly or change the diagnosis. And in order to do that, there has to be some accountability put into place. Otherwise, why will the doctor take the chance? So that's a missing piece there.
Go ahead.
This is a little outside of my area, but I've been involved in a different study that was using AI to predict cases that needed intervention in the operating rooms. And we were doing the usability side, but there were a team of clinicians watching what the AI would alert to make sure they could filter it out so that the clinicians on the ground weren't overwhelmed with a bunch of alerts that didn't mean anything and interrupting their operation. But then there are also people that could actually filter the noise and train the algorithm a little bit better. So it may be that we need the human and the computer interaction up front as this is being perfected to reduce that fear of doing the wrong thing or following the algorithm when it wasn't necessarily the right thing at the time.
Correct. We are working on this just to see what happens when we integrate this AI. Instead of making it a sequence where there's a patient-doctor algorithm in one line, but make it a parallel integration where the doctor doesn't know that there's an AI working. And the doctor gives the final decision, and the AI gives the final decision in parallel, and there's a patient outcome, and the AI matches with that patient outcome and learns like that. And then at the end of this process, the doctor is notified, your decision matched our decision, and thank you for training me. Instead of a pop-up on the screen, no. So that changes, that affects the way a doctor perceives the human behavior is such. So instead of having a sequential integration, a parallel integration for now, just to make sure and have that use case data for a full-fledged implementation later would help.
Okay, we're just about out of time. We'd like to thank all the speakers on our panel for some really good presentations and for some really interesting points in our discussion. And I'd like to invite, there they are.
Here we are. So thank you very much, first of all. So this is the end of our first day. I just, on behalf of Koja and myself, would like to say thank you. Thank you to all of you attending. Thank you to the speakers. You were really fantastic, and I hope everybody enjoyed the session, and I hope you all learned.